we're sharing the screen at this point. Whoop, trying to share the screen. And we are looking at the coming of the American Revolution. Now, if you were in class, I would be dramatic, and I would walk up to the front of the room, and I would tell a story about Lexington Green. And I would tell a story about how the men shivered in the cold, clear April night, standing there in Lexington Green. Then they went into the tavern. They drank quite a bit. The candles flickered lower and lower. It had been a while since Paul Revere had ridden by saying that the redcoats are coming and do that whole thing. But instead, we're just going to say, look, Lexington Green is kind of a pivotal point in American history when a remarkable thing happens. The British opened fire on the Americans. Now you might say, well, that sounds about right. We're leading right into the revolution. So, yep. No. You guys are missing the point. Americans at the time, they were British. The British shooting British citizens. Now, the people in Lexington Green, they were armed, but they just stood there. And what were the British doing anyway? Does anyone know what the British were doing? They were marching from Boston, where they were stationed, to a certain town where there was an armory. There was an armory of American arms that the British were afraid the Americans might use, American British citizens, might use against the British. And they were marching there to take it. Where's there?
Concord.
Yes, Concord. And on the way, they happened to see these Americans standing there in this little podunk nowhere where there's a tavern in Lexington. And the British open fire. The Americans eventually retreat. 8 people are left dead. And this is the start. This is what many people consider to be the start of the American Revolution. Okay, so how did we get there? How did we go from in the French and Indian War, where George Washington is fighting as a British soldier for the British Empire, to in 1775 and 1776, turning against the mother country? How did this happen? And that's the question that we're going to be asking here today. But in order to understand, I think, why this would happen, you have to understand the background just a little bit. As one historian had pointed out in a way that I thought was kind of funny, the British had established the American colonies in more of a fit of absent-mindedness than anything else. You see, the Spanish, as we mentioned, had a very coordinated and direct effort to create their colonies in the New World. But if you remember, the British largely did not. The British crown was sitting there fiddling its thumbs, worried about other things. And they had some other good things to be, worried about, revolutions, glorious revolutions and this sort of thing. And so here we've got these colonies being established. In fact, does anybody know the only colony, British colony, that the crown actually founded in what is now the United States? Of the 13 colonies, the British government officially created one. Which one was it?
Wasn't it Delaware?
Nope.
It's Delaware or Maryland?
Nope. Neither of those two. It was Georgia. Why? Because they had a lot of political prisoners that they had to deal with, so they shipped all the prisoners to Georgia. And then when you think about it, you're like, so that's why Georgia's the way it is, huh? Okay. Actually, that was mean. I'm sure Georgia's a great place. It's just humid. Okay. So England, because of England's vast interest in the American colonies, oh, just kidding, because England hardly knew they were there and paid almost no attention to the American colonies until the 1750s, the Americans kind of did what they wanted, right? They had a great deal of freedom from the mother country. The mother country did not provide a great deal of oversight until the 1750s. What happened in the 1750s that really caused the British crown to go, oh, that is something we need to pay attention to. Turns out we've got colonies over there. Maybe we got to use them for our benefit. What was the event in the 1750s that really allowed the English government to focus on the American colonies? Does anyone know? We
French
just
and Indian
talked.
War.
What was that?
The French and Indian War.
Oh, absolutely. It was the French and Indian War. Look, the British Crown, the whole army was over here in North America. And well, I guess not the whole army, that's hyperbole, but yes, they were here, and they recognized something in the American colonies, that these colonies could potentially be useful. In fact, the British theory that justified the exploitation of the colonies, in fact, and this would be the case clear until the British colonies around the world begin to decline. What was that theory called? It was a economic theory. You guys probably don't know, so I'll just tell you. It's called mercantilism. Anyone ever heard that term, mercantilism? No, okay. So the idea of mercantilism is this, that there is a fixed amount of wealth in the world. To put it even more directly, there is only so much gold in the world. Can you manufacture gold? You can dig it up, but you can't manufacture it, right? And so there's a fixed amount of gold in the world. And let's face it, are the strongest nations in the world, are they rich or are they poor? They're rich. And so if you want to be the dominant nation in the world, it would be wise for you to be an empire, to have an empire, and to go to your colonies and to extrapolate the gold, the wealth, from the colonies and bring it back home to the mother country. Do I have an amen? Amen, hallelujah. And this is how you have a strong country. And so this is called mercantilism. And look, the British Crown agreed with this. They believed it. And so once again, there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and the strongest empires bring home the wealth. And so the British Crown, they're looking at the American colonies, especially after the French and Indian War, where the British find themselves a dominant world power, yes, but also an incredibly indebted world power. They look at the American colonies, and all their colonies, in fact, as definitely means to an end, right? You take the wealth from there, at least you have an excuse to. You don't necessarily have to, but you take the wealth from there and you bring it back home. And under the mercantilist system, beginning really after the French and Indian War, Americans complained about feeling used rather than being respected as, British citizens. The Americans complained that they were being treated like tools, just a bunch of tools, American tools, or even milked cows. What's the purpose of having a milk cow? Not to treat the cow with respect. You milk it, you drink the milk, and then when it gets old, you kill it and eat it. And there's a poem that Ben Franklin wrote. Ben Franklin, of course, is sort of this Renaissance man in America with very interesting lifestyles. He says that the Americans have a peevish mother, and that, of course, peevish mother is Great Britain. That treat us like we are children, even though we are grown and we have minds of our own. And so this is how the American people are beginning to feel. They didn't feel this way previous to the French and the Indian War, because really, I think there was one major tax that they put on the colonies in 1738? Does that sound right to you guys? 1738, something about molasses. They put a tax on molasses. Ooh, oh no, not the molasses. The one tax they had to pay for the first 100 years of their existence in the New World. Like, that's not a big deal. Now, all of a sudden, in the 1760s, there's a revolution in British colonial policy. And this is going to be my argument. My argument as to why the revolution comes on down the line, why the British soldiers will start shooting at the Americans standing there, why these two groups of British people end up shooting and killing one another. It's because there is a very quick and big change in the way that the British Crown treats the American colonies. So this is my thesis. There was a minimal involvement from 1607 until after the French and the Indian War. Does anyone know what that time is called? Historians have a term for the policy of the British Crown's involvement with the colonies in America during that time. It's called the policy of, it's a term you need to be familiar with, by the way. It's called salutary neglect. Anyone ever heard that before? Salutary neglect? It should have been in your reading. Okay. If you don't know the term, write it down and highlight it. Salutary neglect. It's that minimal involvement from 1607 until really the 1760s. And then all of a sudden, the British government started doing the math and realized, you know what, we are in an incredible amount of debt for winning that war. In fact, so think about this from the British perspective really, really quickly. The Americans, well, let's back up, I guess, really. Yeah, let's back up a tad bit just to clear up any misconceptions. I'm assuming that you guys know that the Americans were British and they weren't fighting the British, right? You know that. You also know that when we say that the French and Indian War, the French and the Indians, were they fighting each other? No, they were what? They were allies. And so when the Americans and the British, you know, all the British, fought the French and the Indians, the French got to pack up and go home. But what about the Indians? They were still in America, yes? And the British government felt that now that they've made the Indians mad, it would make a great deal of sense to keep some British soldiers stationed in the in the colonies in order to protect colonial interests and British citizens there. Does that make sense? But does that cost money? Does it cost money to have an army anywhere? Were the Americans really paying any tax?
No.
No, they weren't. And so the British felt that the Americans ought to at least pay for their own keep, right? The British said, hey, we are protecting the American British colonists from Indian attack, so they should pay for that. After all, we're very much in debt. And so that was one of the reasons behind the Grenville Acts. And so George Grenville, who was a member of Parliament, argued that they should put a tax on the Americans, and they placed a whole bunch of different taxes, all sorts of different taxes on the American people. And the Americans were very unhappy with all of a sudden having to pay these taxes. And so they felt that this was a threat to their liberty. Additionally, and this is still the case for many Americans, they don't really like paying taxes. And I got to admit something to you, I don't really like paying taxes either. In fact, if you look at the amount of taxes that the Americans paid at the very worst, where they paid the highest taxes, so you're talking about like sort of don't think in terms of class, but let's, sort of a middle of the road, middle class. They don't really have classes like that back then, but think of like a middle of the road, middle class sort of person. The percentage that they paid in taxes was at worst was far less than what I pay in taxes. Far less percentage-wise. And so my tax burden, it far exceeds anything that the colonists had to pay. Think about that for a minute. And you might say, well, Mr. Cook, you work at a private school. Of course, you make so much money. That's a funny one. And by the way, people who don't know anything about Christian schools or private schools, they think the teachers make a lot of money. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Yeah. I'm not going to tell you what I make. I haven't even told my wife yet. I don't want her to divorce me. But anyway, let's continue. That was a joke. That was a joke. They, yeah. So the other question that the Americans had was, hey, these British, the British government has their military here. Maybe that's because they want to keep us under control. After all, we are in 1775. It's the British people marching from what town to Concord?
Boston.
Boston.
Boston. When was the last time Indians attacked in Boston?
Never.
1644. Okay, that was over 100 years ago. And unless you count the Boston Tea Party as an actual Indian attack, which it wasn't, then what does that make any sense? And so the Americans started thinking, hey, I mean, and you probably would too. Why do the British have soldiers here? It's not because of Indians. It's got to be something else. Maybe it's to keep us under control, to keep their their eyes on us. And so the Americans said, hey, we need to have, if you want to tax us, we need to have representation. And so this makes me always feel better whenever I'm like, but my tax load is too high. Then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, but you know what? I do have representation. I've got Kate Brown. Okay, so the Americans got to be in a very, very snotty, grumpy mood about paying these taxes, and they fought and they fought and they fought against it, and then finally Grenville was kicked out, and the next group that came into Parliament was like, okay, we give up. We're not going to tax the Americans. And so the Americans defeated the stamp tax, and they were pretty, and by the way, in case you're wondering, stamp tax, we're not talking about postage stamps, we're talking about like official documents. Anything that has like official legal quality to it that's recognized by the government would have a stamp. So things like marriage licenses would have a stamp on it because they're legally recognized by the British government. That sort of thing would be taxed. Okay, so the Americans, though, in making their arguments, would initially claim that the king was the one who had, now of course you might say this doesn't make any sense, and no, it doesn't really, but the king doesn't have really any, the king has the authority and Parliament doesn't really have much authority, and this will ultimately lead to revolutionary consequences, right? And so the Americans, if you remember from your reading, keep petitioning the king. Hey king, we need to have representation. Hey king, listen to our complaints. Hey king, here's an olive branch petition. And then the king ultimately comes back not sympathetic to the Americans, and this leads them to declare their independence. But before we get to that, we have a new guy come to power. His name is Charlie Townshend. Oh, Charles, how many of you enjoy some like a British guy that's sort of blustery and so what he would do is he would drink pretty heavily. And he'd drink so heavily, in fact, that he was known for having a very loose tongue when he would go speak on the floor of Parliament. And if you've never watched the British Parliament, tune into TV sometime or find it on YouTube. You think the Americans are mean and nasty. The British, they like mock each other. And I mean, it's just, they like throw things, they yell, they curse at each other in Parliament. It's just not how we do it in America, until you've seen the debate, of course, 2 nights ago. Maybe we're just adopting British ways, I don't know. It sounds better when they have British accents. Anyway, Charlie Townshend's drinking, goes onto the floor of Parliament, and he would apparently give these like very, very good, long-winded speeches that everyone kind of liked, but he wouldn't remember them afterwards because he had been drinking. So one time, while maybe drinking a bit too much, said he was going to pluck the feathers of the colonial goose with the minimum of squawking with the taxes that he was going to pass on the colonists. Now, look, the Americans, they're not dumb. They can, and by the way, at least they weren't dumb. Maybe we are dumb today, I don't know. You guys know that there's all sorts of taxes that you pay and I pay that are hidden. They hide them in the prices. They are very sneaky with the way that taxes are done. Did you know that we have like $1 a gallon tax on our gasoline? I bet you didn't know that. They don't tell you that. It's hidden in the price. Yeah, anyway. And so he says this. And by the way, when the Americans read it in the papers, when they read that the prime ministers referring to them as a goose that's going to be plucked, but the Americans are so dumb that they won't even know it, so they won't squawk. How do you think the Americans are going to respond to a statement like that? Like, oh, thank you for calling us a goose. Oh, and thank you for plucking. What's the purpose of plucking a goose?
To get the feathers, to get the money.
Okay, well, get the feathers. Okay. But what's the real purpose of plucking a goose?
So you
Kill
can
it.
eat it.
To eat the goose. Okay, so when the Americans read this, they're like, oh, so that guy thinks he's going to have us for dinner, huh? Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And after having defeated the stamp tax, the Americans were in a very rebellious mood, and they had been feeling a bit successful. And so, as I mentioned, the new taxes that Townsend placed were pretty indirect, put them on tea, and so the Americans began to smuggle tea in and smuggling some other things in, simply to avoid paying taxes. Now, let's talk really quickly here about the British soldiers who stayed in Boston. They tended to be ruffians, frankly. I mean, think about it. If you're British, do you take your best soldiers from protecting your nation and send them to Podunk Colony nowhere and be like, hey guys, you really need it over here. I hear there's Indians. Or do you take your nastiest, worst, most worthless soldiers and send them to America? You're going to take your least impressive soldiers. And so these guys were oftentimes ruffians. They drank quite a bit. There were accusations, especially after the Quartering Act, where in order to house these soldiers, some Americans were forced to keep these soldiers in their homes. So if you think about it, there's these soldiers, they're pretty much immune. There's nothing that a court in America could really do to them. There were accusations of these soldiers taking, we'll just say, liberties with the daughters of colonists, drinking. So yeah, not the best guys. There were a few accusations of rape and this sort of thing. And so, so the Americans do not love this. And then when they hear that they have to pay for it, you have to pay for these people being in your backyard, you don't want them. That just makes the liberty-loving colonials grumpy about it. And so they love to taunt those poor British soldiers. They call them bloody bags. Now, they obviously had red coats. They're also known as red coats. But bloody backs was kind of a term that would be used that was pretty derogatory, a bloody back. Now, you might say, well, how's that derogatory? Well, maybe you don't really realize this, but when the British are running around saying, oh, this is the bloody ship on the sink on me on the way, blah, 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 blah. Well, bloody means damned, right? So you're cursing it. So when a British person says, well, that was bloody awful, they're saying that's damned awful. They're cursing. And so when the Americans are calling the soldiers bloody backs, they're cursing at them. Not only do they curse at them, but look, back in these days, this is kind of before, so most of the Americans were Christians, but this is back before the whole temperance thing, right? When Christians drank. And Christians still do drink, many of them, but there is a temperance strain of Christianity that's particularly strong in today American evangelicalism. And so for you, the idea that Christians would go to a tavern and drink might be kind of weird, but that was pretty common. So in Boston, the Puritans are all sitting there in the tavern drinking, and it's late at night, and it's kind of a late spring snow, and the inevitable clash, of course, happens at it's known as the Boston Massacre. And so you've got these Americans, and they've been drinking, and then they see the bloody backs, right? There's a poor sentinel soldier standing there outside his post, or at his post outside of the barracks, and he's just standing there. It's 1 a.m, and the drunken Americans come up and they're like, hey, let's pick on that guy. And so they start calling him names and making fun of him. And then one of them starts throwing snowballs, and then they start shoving rocks in the snowballs and making ice balls and chucking ice balls at this poor soldier. And then one of the guys that there's some rope makers for boat, the ships, the big ropes that they use for shipping. So they got these clubs that would beat, and so they're like swinging the club around it at the soldier, and then the soldier calls for the other guys, his friends that are in the barracks to come on out and like help him. And then something happens. No one knows exactly what happens, but in a big So now it's kind of like a mob, right? And of course, you guys have seen videos of mobs here in Portland pretty recently, I'm assuming. It's a little bit chaotic. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know who's to blame for what. But one of the British soldiers, and of course, what good is an unloaded musket? None. It's like no good. So they all actually had loaded muskets. And in a ruckus, when you hear a shot go off, that's the signal to what?
Shoot back.
To fire, right? And so unfortunately, one of the soldiers' guns accidentally goes off, or it may have been a pistol musket that someone had in the crowd. We have no idea. One of them goes off, and then the soldiers, because it's a big ruckus, thinks their captain has ordered them to fire on the crowd, and so they do, leaving several dead. And yeah, pretty shocking. They're put on trial. John Adams actually defends the soldiers and mostly gets them off. Pretty amazing. By the way, the Boston Massacre was such a popular holiday in Boston that it remained a holiday for a long time, and for a while even rivaled eventually the 4th of July. Eventually 4th of July replaces it, but they called it Massacre Day. So they celebrate Massacre Day pretty regularly in the whole of Northeast, but especially in Boston. Okay, so what was King George doing? He was doing his very best to try to restore the power of the monarchy, and so dealing with the Americans being obnoxious was not something he really wanted to deal with. As a good typical British monarch, he was focused on things at home rather than over there in the United States. So the British redoubled their navigation acts, their efforts, and the Americans refused to cooperate. So much so that they'd even pay extra, many of them, to buy tea that was smuggled in rather than to buy the tea that was required for them to purchase, ultimately by the British Crown. And there were some other taxes in here as well. Ultimately, the British pretty well lets it all go except for the tea tax. I want to mention really quickly here, Sam Adams, cousin of John Adams, was known as the penman of the Revolution. He also brewed beer. Maybe that was what they were drinking when they attacked the soldiers outside the barracks there in Boston. I don't know. But we're about out of time, aren't we? Dang it. So anyway, I guess we'll leave it off right here. And to make things really, really quickly broad, in order to save a British company that paid a huge amount of taxes to the British government decided to give a monopoly to that company in America and tax the tea. Now, the company, the British East Indies Company, had so much extra tea on hand that they just wanted to offload it, and they were willing to sell it to the Americans at a loss. Okay, which meant that even after you added the tea tax onto the tea, the Americans were paying less for the taxed East Indian tea than they were paying for the smuggled Dutch tea. Yeah, so literally, the price of tea went down. And that made them, well, the taxes made them mad. So of course, you're familiar with the Boston Tea Party, right? And that's when they threw all the tea overboard and the fish got caffeine highs for several weeks. And the reaction to the Boston Tea Party was extremists rejoiced. They loved it. The conservatives shuddered. And most Americans were like, oh, this is kind of embarrassing. And so, yeah, there you have it. This leads to the First Continental Congress. And then after that is where we have the Lexington situation. So I know I'm moving really quickly here to end this. But the conclusion, as you may have been able to draw from this, having grown independent with the term of salutary neglect, colonists strongly reacted to the involvement of the British government in America and the taxes, even going so far as to pay extra to not pay taxes. And this, of course, will lead to that clash on Lexington Green. and the March to Concord. By the way, what happens to the British at Concord? They're defeated by the Americans at Concord and pushed back into Boston, where they sit there and try to mount several other attacks, and ultimately are defeated at Bunker Hill, and they hop on their boats, and then they decide to go elsewhere. Okay, guys, that's all I got for you. Sorry I took a little bit longer than I intended. We'll see you on Monday. Don't forget to read chapter 7. Some of you, Chloe, I'll be seeing you this afternoon. Okay, guys, see ya. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.